Ross Young is giving us a glimmer of hope for the MacBook Air lineup, which I'm very excited to hear about because he's been right about a lot of things in the past. Even though this rumor is talking mostly about next year, not this year, it's still something I'm very excited for. Let's begin. So, ever since this transition to Apple Silicon, I think a lot of people have kind of grasped a bit more at hope that Apple would start offering more display size options for the MacBook Air. And no, I'm not talking about that stupid 11-inch one. Ugh, my god, that just should not exist. Way too small for a Mac. But later this year, there's rumored to be a more colorful, chassis redesigned version of the MacBook Air sporting the M2 chip. And there's a lot of people out there that can already attest to the M1, despite the fact that it's not as crazy fast as the M1 Pro, Max, or Ultra, is still a plenty fast CPU. I mean, I reviewed the M1 MacBook Air when it came out, and I was able to do all of my intensive video editing on it. I was able to live stream off of it, even though that was a fanless architecture. There's like barely any cooling system in place for that chip. It's still plenty fast. So it's not necessarily about making slower 15-inch laptops. It's just about acknowledging that this M2 chip coming later in the year, which is going to have even better integrated graphics than the M1 and probably even faster CPU speed on the M2. Why then do people need to spend, $2,400-$2,500 to get a MacBook larger than 14 inches? Because that is not a screen size that is just restricted to pros. My wife is a classic example of someone who bought a 15-inch MacBook Pro, not because she planned on doing like lots of power intensive things on her laptop. She just liked the larger size, especially because a lot of people watch content on their MacBooks, and even if you're just doing light things like web browsing, it's kind of helpful to have a larger screen that you can pack around with you. But part of the downsides of restricting the 15-inch and 16-inch screen sizes to the MacBook Pros is because typically when you do, you have to pack around all of this extra computational stuff, which also requires more of a thermal system, and that thermal system also requires a bigger battery. So at the end of the day, you're left with this really, really thick kind of chunk laptop because you have to carry around all of these other performance metrics to justify having the larger screen because it's for pros, right? Now I think Apple Silicon is getting so fast, even when it doesn't have fans, even when it doesn't have a cooling system in place, and it sounds like later this year Apple is even considering catering to the iPhone market that wants larger size displays but isn't necessarily looking for pro class hardware. That's what the iPhone 14 Max is rumored to be, a 6.7-inch display, but it's still 60 hertz and it just has 2 cameras. It doesn't have LiDAR because honestly, who cares about LiDAR? But also just making a cheaper option for people that still appreciate a larger screen. I think the Mac lineup is desperate for this type of attention because everyone's always trying to suggest some kind of middle tier MacBook, because the 14-inch MacBook Pro starts at $2,000 and the MacBook Air starts at $1,000. People keep advocating for something in between that's not the 13-inch MacBook Pro because that thing is just so dated and people want a regular MacBook. But I think with Apple Silicon being so powerful, you don't really need a middle tier MacBook when you can achieve such great performance in a thin and lightweight design like the MacBook Air. In my opinion, what would make the lineup a lot more symmetrical and easy to understand is that there's a slightly more expensive version of the MacBook Air that comes with better battery life and a bigger display. But I imagine because it's not sporting an M1 Pro or M1 Max, and it doesn't need necessarily the best battery life in the world, they could probably make it much, much thinner and lighter. And I think this would become a very popular option among Mac buyers because they could buy a laptop that's still thin and lightweight, but with a screen size much larger than 13 inches. So you just have that much more breathing room when you're doing web browsing, or even if you're doing video editing and that kind of thing. I fully agree. Having the larger screen size is helpful and it lets your content breathe a little bit as you're editing it. And Mark Gurman has talked about Apple doing this as well. He's just said that they're not quite ready to implement it in this new generation MacBook Air launching later in the year, so they want to push it off until 2023. That sucks that we have to wait a bit longer for that because I definitely want to see this thing exist now, but at the same time, I can understand that there's a lot of new changes coming with the M2 MacBook Air. This is really the first time they've updated the chassis of the Air in 4 years. Basically, they've kind of just reused the same MacBook Air design since 2018. They've swapped out the keyboard and they've swapped out Intel for the M1, but overall, there's a lot of recycling going on in terms of manufacturing. So having new color options and having an even thinner design and adopting MagSafe and just kind of designing a Mac from the ground up for an Apple Silicon chip like the M2 is probably a big undertaking, and they don't want to complicate things a bit too much because they likely do want to try to prioritize pricing right now best they can. So I get why they're postponing it, and maybe we have to wait for the M3 chip before the 15-inch MacBook Air happens, but I know there's a lot of Mac buyers out there that hold on to their Macs for, 4, 5, sometimes 7, 8 years. So if some of you have been holding on to your MacBook Pro or MacBook Air for a while and you're thinking, yeah, it's fine for now, but I might want to update in a couple years, this might be one of those MacBooks to look out for, because I think the performance will still be plenty fast, definitely much faster than any Intel MacBook currently, and if there's a way to get a thinner and more lightweight version of a 15-inch MacBook, that's gonna be killer, and I think the value will be much better than that of the current MacBook Pros. Do you guys think Apple is doing this, or do you think that the value would be so good it would start cannibalizing a lot of MacBook Pro sales? All that good stuff, let me know what you're thinking down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you all in the next one.